Hello, my name is Teresa McDermott, and I host a series of talks at the Gainsborough Hotel in Bath entitled Phenomenal Women, a series of inspired thoughts and ideas to share in association with Business West and Bath Business News. This is our third year, and whilst the hotel is closed, I would like to invite you to join me in a virtual event, hearing from past or new phenomenal speakers, all sharing their wisdom, warmth, compelling insight, and captivating stories. Today, I would like to welcome Harriet Shortt, who is Associate Professor of Organisation Studies at the University of the West of England. Harriet's research focuses on organisational space, artefacts, the materiality of work, and visual methodologies. Harriet is working remotely and from home, and as you can see, she's got a really interesting studio.
Which we had built, and my husband, who works from home, has one side and there's a wall, and then I have the other side. I get the bigger side because I've got more books. So yeah, but I'm very lucky to have this space. So yeah.
Okay, so can you tell us a bit about the research work that you've been doing on workspace? What does that involve?
Yeah, sure. So I've got two areas of research expertise. As you said, I work at UWE in Bristol Business School, and the majority of my work is based on the physical work environment. So I'm interested in the environment, the physical space, the place, the materiality of work, and how spaces and places of work impact the everyday lives of workers. So my research to explore that involves using visual methods. So I use photography, participant-led photography in my research. So any organisation I go into to do a piece of work to explore the everyday life of workers and their spaces involves asking them to take pictures of how it feels to work in a particular space, or pictures of whatever it is that we might be researching. So I've worked in lots of different organisations. So I did some work with the Environment Agency, where we did a sort of a post-occupancy evaluation of what was then a new building in Bristol city centre, to explore how a new open plan hot desking environment was impacting working practices for employees. People took photographs, and then I conducted interviews with those participants of the research. And have recently done a big project in the business school. We had a brand new building built, and we did a big post-occupancy evaluation on that building, also involving images. So it's essentially asking people how it feels to work in a particular place, and how the space impacts everyday life. So that's what I focus on.
Right. So over the past few months, what have you noticed about people's attitudes to working from home? How are people adjusting to this?
Well, I guess it's kind of shifted over the past few months. Obviously, we were all kind of pushed into this massive social experiment, I guess, of working at home. So, you know, working at home practices have been around for some time. There's a great campaign organisation called Workwise UK, and they've been talking about working at home and smarter working practices and flexible working since probably 2006, 2007. So it's been around for a while. But of course, a situation like this, everyone got thrust into it literally overnight, and with no real time to adjust. And so it's been quite interesting to see different attitudes kind of emerging from that. I think one big thing is that working from home was often seen as a sort of quick fix to work-life balance, good for the environment, and yeah, you know, people can work at home and people can set up. I think what's happened in this experience, obviously this is kind of coloured by the fact that this is a very unusual context in which we're working. So it's sort of overlaid with the, you know, being in the middle of a public health crisis. So I guess we have to look at it through that lens, but it certainly highlighted how much more complicated I think working from home is. I think people's attitudes to it, people can see that it is a complicated space in which to negotiate, particularly because our homes have suddenly, like you said at the beginning, they've kind of been hijacked. So home, which was home, private, sanctuary, retreat, family sort of space, all of a sudden becomes a classroom, it becomes a workspace, it becomes a gym, becomes a place of worship. It becomes everything because we were in one place for all activities and practices. So that made it very complicated. And I think people suddenly saw actually working from home involves negotiating quite complex boundaries, particularly with those that you're sharing the space with. I guess that's on an individual basis. From an organisational perspective, and from maybe leadership team perspective, what I've noticed in attitudes has been quite extreme. So if you sort of think about it as sort of two different attitudes, one has been organisations who thought about you being in the office and being visible in the office meant you were working. So they kind of were rolled up in a sort of presenteeist culture where you would be expected to be in the office and that meant you were working, and there was some mistrust around working at home. All of a sudden, loads of organisations that I'm talking to are suddenly really warm to the idea of working at home. I've been writing a book chapter on sort of life after COVID-19 and workplaces with a co-author, and we've been talking to various organisations and people in different professions, and you know, they've been saying to us, you know, actually before COVID I wasn't keen on my team working at home and I wanted to be able to see them in the office, and actually now after COVID-19, when it's all over, I'm going to be really happy with my team working at home maybe 2-3 days a week. So there's been a real shift in attitude, which I think is a really positive thing. Attitudes towards people who are currently working at home in a crisis I've also seen some really great examples of organisational communication where leadership teams have evidence behaviour that supports particularly working parents, I think, surrounding the juggles that a lot of us are facing. On the flip side of that, and trust comes back into this as well, some organisations have not dealt with people working at home at all well, and there is still that sort of presenteeism culture. There is still that mistrust. If I can't see you, are you working? And there's been a real sense of kind of monitoring and controlling employees. So when we've been talking to different organisations, or employees rather, they've been telling us that there was one public sector organisation employee that we spoke to, and they said that their leadership team had asked them to take selfies of where they were during the working day, following an email, and within I think it was something like a 20-minute window of getting the email, you had to send a selfie to show where you were, and it's practices like that. There was another employee who was asked to keep a journal of activities of what they were doing during the day on top of their workload, you know, and it's sort of this monitoring of staff that shows that organisations are not comfortable, their attitudes haven't shifted, there's still that sense of, if you're not in the office, what are you doing? I think the worst one I heard was from a young mother working at home whose husband works away, who said that her boss on a Zoom call had said, you know, I want to remind you, you're not on leave, and this isn't an excuse to be playing puzzles and watching Netflix all day, you know, and it's attitudes like that. I query whether that man would have said it to a man, but because she's at home looking after 2 young children and trying to hold down a full-time job, you know, there's a real tension there. So I think attitudes, you know, to me, I've seen from an organisational perspective quite extreme. Some really fantastic examples of people moving forward and shifting, and others where that there's still a sense of mistrust.
And I think a lot of what we do in our workspace also revolves around our social engagements. And so one of the classics is like the chats around the photocopier. And so much you can never underestimate, can you, the amount of information that is shared informally. You know, they might not have spoken about it in a formal meeting, but informally, so many people get themselves up to date. How is that translating into Zoom?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of, I mean, I guess there's some informal parts that are. So I mean, Zoom's a really interesting one, I think, because, well, like you said at the beginning, you know, oh, that's your home office, you know, I can see it's full of books. There's been a kind of almost lovely, it's got its flip sides, but certainly from people that we've been speaking to, there's a real sense that Zoom and other platforms are really, they open up your home. Essentially, you're inviting people into what is typically a private sort of space, and there's lots of comments, and you kind of see it on the news as well, don't you? People looking at the shelves and looking at the books and what have you got in the background? Yeah, exactly. What does it say about you? And there's a sense of, I guess, I mean, there's the extreme. I think it's called Room Rater on Twitter. It's a new Twitter handle. And it's basically people commenting, often quite harshly, on sort of famous people's sort of backgrounds that they can see in whatever capacity. So there's a sort of sense of voyeurism, which is quite interesting. But I think in terms of informal relationships, it's been really beneficial for some people. So a lot of people I've spoken to across different sectors have said actually it's brought us closer together, because you've been able to sort of see another side to somebody. You get to see different parts of their identity, including their pets and their children. I know we were talking the other week, and my daughter came in. I've told her to stay away today, but there's that element of breaking down boundaries, I think, that maybe are a little bit more formal in the workplace, where maybe different identities are seen and experienced. So I think Zoom's really humanized people at work. You know, you're seeing your boss, or, you know, seeing colleagues literally in a different space, has really opened up relationships in a positive way for a lot of people. I think on the flip side of that, there's a sort of a vulnerability to it. I mean, you know, things like Room Rater, although it's obviously something that's perhaps, you know, for sort of social commentary on Twitter, you know, on the ground for everyday workers, inviting people into your home that you might, you know, colleagues that you might not like, people that you're not familiar with, you know, and I don't know, maybe there's that pressure to put on the video, not put on the video, that it's a sort of almost invasion of that privacy. You know, the privacy's been sort of compromised, I guess. And the first time I was conscious of this was when my daughter, who was having an online lesson with one of her teachers, commented on her teacher's kitchen, and said something about the tiles in the kitchen in a positive sort of way. But I think that somehow, you know, that changes the sort of power dynamic in a relationship. And it made me think about teachers in particular in this crisis. You've had to open up their homes to students. You know, what does that do to the power dynamic and the boundaries that we deliberately create in some professions? So I think there's some interesting, helpful things there in terms of how we develop the informal parts of our relationships at work. But I guess nothing can really replace those, like you say, the photocopier chats at the water cooler, in the toilet, at the hand basins, you know, those sorts of informal, ad hoc, and that's the main thing. It's ad hoc, isn't it? You know, they're sharing stories, learning goes on in those sorts of spaces, or creative ideas might happen in those sorts of spaces. And And I guess, you know, with Zoom, you can't be ad hoc. Not that I can think, you know, it's scheduled, right? So you schedule it and then you're there. You know, I've heard lots of teams trying to sort of have, you know, coffee breaks together, and you come together, but it's still scheduled and it's still bound. Whereas those corridor chats and who you might bump into when you're washing your hands in the toilet, they're different. And I don't think we can really replace those.
No. Over the past few months, have you noticed where people are working from in their homes? How are they creating the workspaces? You know, because obviously some people have loads of space, and other people are having to negotiate space with their children, with other family members.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. I mean, everyone's working everywhere, right? I think, you know, there's this sort of appropriation and reappropriation of spaces all day, every day in people's homes. And I think that's what's, you know, really important to remember through all this. You know, there's loads of advice out there and lots of discussion, and you know, but we kind of need to remember that everyone's experiencing this in very, very different ways. You know, you know, people, there will be like every individual case will be quite different. You know, I've been thinking about some of my students who work in or live in shared houses, you know, and lots of people live in shared houses, you know, and so they're working in their bedrooms a lot of the time. Now that's okay. You know, I don't think there's any, you know, I don't think we should have any rules and regulations around where we work and why it might be good or bad. You know, like I say, it's different for different people, and it depends on what you're doing, of course, what activities you're doing. Or tasks that are part of your work. But I think, you know, for people in shared houses, they're sort of working and in their bedrooms, and so they're seeking other places to have breaks or just to relax. And so I was talking to somebody the other day, and they were saying, yeah, we're now using the front step of our house as a little place to go. You know, that front step by the front door is a place to break from work. You know, it's not the kitchen where we're still using it as a kitchen, and it's not the living room where we watch TV and come together. You know, actually the step outside becomes this really important sort of reflective space for people. So I guess, I mean, it sort of made me think about, I write quite a bit about liminal spaces in the workplace. So liminal spaces are spaces in between. So dominant spaces at work are things like staff rooms and lecture theatres, you know, places that we can define. Liminal spaces are in between transitory sorts of spaces. They're kind of what we were just talking about. You know, they're toilets, corridors, the photocopier in the corridor, lifts, doorsteps, doorways. They're kind of spaces in between. And what I've noticed through various conversations and looking at stuff on social media about where people are working is that those liminal spaces of our homes have suddenly become quite important. So in our homes, we have, you know, the kitchen, that's the kitchen, and the classroom, the dining room, that's the dining room. We're reappropriating those spaces for work or becoming a classroom, you know, if you're homeschooling. But liminal spaces of the home are suddenly being used in different ways for different reasons. So I'm working with an entrepreneur in Bristol, and she and I are working on this project where she's keeping a video diary of what it's like to be an entrepreneur. And she sent me a video a few weeks back of her on her roof, the roof of her house in Bristol. And she said, oh, this is becoming a really important place because the house is just chaotic. You know, there's kids at home, and she's got a lodger, and her husband's working at home, she's working at home, everybody's everywhere. And the roof was her sanctuary, if you like. It was her place for reflection. And that's the equivalent, you know, I see the equivalent in my research in offices. Liminal spaces are being used for actual work. So I've got colleagues who are sort of working in hallways and on stairs, who are taking phone calls, you know, in liminal spaces of their homes, because it's a sort of in-between place where their kids aren't, and maybe their partner isn't, you know, they've sort of got a bit in between that they can sort of territory. So yeah, people are kind of, I don't know, I find it quite interesting that the home, you know, people are finding the corners of their homes useful in new ways. In terms of how people are creating a workspace, I guess one of the things that I've noticed is that people seem to be finding great joy in quite small things, which casts an interesting light on what they lack, therefore, in the office. So there's lots of images. I follow lots of hashtags and groups on Instagram about working from home, and there's loads of pictures of people who are commenting on, you know, a lovely mug that they've got on their desk, and a candle that they've lit, and a new house plant that they've bought, and they sort of created a little space, you know, with nice objects and things. And I guess, I mean, I'm interested in that from a materiality kind of perspective, because that's in stark contrast to a lot of knowledge worker spaces, which are clear desk policy, open plan, hot desk, no personal objects allowed. Yet through this, how people are constructing a little workspace is quite personal. There's sort of the joy of small things that people seem to be honing in on. So yeah, that's what I've noticed.
Going forward, how do you feel our working practices may change, if they are going to change? Do you think they will?
I mean, I think the attitudes to working from home, as we talked about at the beginning, I think that will have a big impact. I think working from home, people will now be warmer to. But I mean, I've read things and I've seen things about, you know, the death of the office, and will we ever go back, and, you know, what can the office possibly offer us now if people have got so used to working at home. But I think our working practices will be much more fluid. I think they'll, I was reading something in one of the sort of workplace design magazines, and they were talking about the future and having a sort of an ecosystem of workplaces, so that you would have a bit of time in the office, a bit of time at home, other spaces that might exist. I mean, we were in a massive boom of co-working spaces right across the world. So, you know, all these various different designs and structures of co-working spaces where you can go and rent space for just a few hours, and you don't have to be in a cafe, you don't have to be at home, but you don't have to be in the office. And there are these sorts of other spaces that exist, if you like. So I think our working practices in terms of where we work might change. The thing is, we're social cultural beings. I don't think it is the death of the office. You know, we want to be together at certain times for certain tasks. So I think, you know, just saying, oh yeah, working from home's the new normal. I mean, we're kind of still in it, right? I mean, as we're talking now, we're still in, largely people are still working at home. I don't know when the university will open again. You know, it's a logistical nightmare. I don't envy that job. That's really, really complicated. So it is for the foreseeable future, but people will want to come back together at some point. So I think our working practices will shift, having seen that working from home can work, but I think other spaces will become important for collaboration and being together. I think when work is performed might change. So, you know, we've kind of got into this practice of, well, many people I've spoken to have got into a practice of okay, you know, let's not think about productivity in a normal sense, because it's not normal times. It's kind of output, not the hours that you work. So, and because people are juggling many different things, particularly working parents, you know, you've got weird working hours, and you've got to kind of stop and start different activities. And I just wonder whether our working practices will shift in terms of when we decide to do things. You know, we might decide to do things when we want to do them, and break that up with, you know, a bit of gardening, or a bit of DIY, or a bit of cooking, you know. And actually, could that be a really good thing? If we do break up the working day, if we do have more time at home, with activities that clearly for a lot of people are really important in relation to their well-being. The fact that we can down tools after a bout of replying to emails and go and do a bit of gardening, and then go back to the report that we need to write. Actually, yeah, I mean, so is it the death of 9 to 5 rather than the death of the office? Might be something to sort of think about. And certainly, I hope our.
Yeah, well, I was just going to add that this style of working only really came in through the Industrial Revolution, didn't it? A bit prior to that, we worked as we needed to work. We worked in the fields with the daylight hours, and when it was finished, and what have you. There wasn't this set pattern. People didn't live their lives by clocks and time scales. And it's actually in terms of our evolution, it's quite a recent thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, for those of us, I mean, I've been working at home for a really long time, you know, most of my career, and I mean, always pros and cons to these sorts of things, and particularly boundary making at working at home. But the fact that you can sort of manipulate and maneuver different activities around your work is incredibly beneficial, I think, for a lot of people, and having the opportunity to do that. So I'm hoping that this sort of mass social extreme experiment might help people to reflect on it's the activities that you do through the day, but when you decide to do them, in what order. As long as you're not working for one of these organisations that ask you to take selfies through the day to evidence where you are, then of course that's fine.
I guess it's a lot around the work that you do as Associate Professor of Organisational Studies. You will be very influential in changing people's opinions about that going forward, based on the work that you're doing now. Would you say?
I may be influential. I mean, I hope. I mean, I think. I mean, those of us in organisation studies, in the field largely, you know, talk about the sorts of things that are impacting people now. You know, myself and my colleagues, you know, we're all. I guess we've all got a little bit to chip in to the conversation about moving forward. I'm interested in people's attitudes to workspace. I'm interested in, you know, the return to the office and how that might work. And and I've been asked by quite a number of organisations over the past few months to comment on these things, and that's what's really exciting, because it brings sort of research, you know, alive. It, you know, it brings it to a much bigger population, which is great. But my colleagues, you know, they're doing the same thing. You know, there's conversations about, you know, how you better develop, you know, virtual and online communities in the workplace. People are talking about gender and how the experience of this has impacted perhaps men and women differently. You know, all experts in their field, in the study of organisations and people. You know, I think everyone's got, you know, something that they can chip in, which hopefully can be, even if it's just a way of encouraging organisations and staff to reflect a bit more on what's happening. Because I think that's the thing, is that we're so busy having to manage this situation and just get through it. You know, and I've had those moments where you are just trying to get through the week, or just trying to get through the day, and organisations are no different. They, you know, it's a really, really horrendously challenging time for everybody in different ways. So you know, the luxury of sitting around reflecting, saying, you know, how has this impacted? You know, maybe it's a little bit early for that, I think. Like I say, we're still kind of in it, aren't we? So
I've got two more questions for you. One is, what would be your kind of top tips to employers to help with people's transition from working to be able to work at home effectively, and to take that step that now that people have been working from home, and yes, they'll be going back to the office, but what would you, like a few top tips you would give to an employer to be able to maximize on the benefits that there have been of people being able to do this?
So is that so top tips for employers in terms of working at home?
Yes, so that so that going forward, like you commented about, some organizations really want their people to be in the office, but then have found actually it's been working quite fine, and it being more about task delivery than the fact that you're there from 9 till 5 or whatever your hours happen to be. Are there some sort of top tips that you could say to an employer? Well, why don't you think about it like this?
Well, I mean, I would, if I was talking to employers, I would say, beware the word productivity through all this and going back to the office. I think it's a really, there was a lot of conversation about it right at the beginning, sort of 3 months ago. Everyone was talking about, how you remain productive at work. And it's sort of, and there was a real sense of people suddenly becoming overly productive, who all of a sudden we had this time working at home and we were going to learn a new language and we were going to do the garden and lose weight and do our work and homeschool our children, and that's real, that's toxic productivity that is not good for a sense of well-being and sort of managing, particularly in a crisis, and it's not helpful for organizations to talk about productivity and remaining productive, because this is not normal. I don't want, we've overused the word unprecedented, but it is an unprecedented time, so we can't talk about it in that sort of normal sense. So I think thinking about, sort of task orientation, the output as opposed to the hours that you work, lots of organizations are really funny about people sending emails late at night with this, I guess, with the best of intentions to say, only work 9 to 5, and we don't want any emails sent after whatever. I kind of get that, but as you said, that's a socially constructed idea of work, right? Like the 9 to 5. Who says, and who cares actually? As long as your work gets done, does it really matter? And actually, for a lot of working parents, particularly working women, that's when they get to do their emails, later at night. So don't judge that. Allow that to happen. And yes, there are other issues around that in terms of boundary making and what have you. But I think, allowing those things, allowing flex in some of that is really important. And I'd also say beware of productivity going back to the office, which is sort of something that I'm starting to think about. Is it going to be business as usual? Going back to the office, are we suddenly going to be expected to go, okay, right, you're back in the office, okay, right, we'll crack on with this project then? We've got to, I think employers should be really wary of that transition back in. It's a bit like when you go, well, certainly from my experience and other people I've spoken to, when you go back to work after maternity leave, right, you've had this major life experience, and then you go back to work and it's like, right, okay, back to work then. And there's very little understanding of the transition and time it takes to adjust. And I think that's going to be something we might want to think about in relation to going back to the office, is productivity will also be different, look different. We should use a different word, because people will need to talk and they will need to heal and they'll need those corridor conversations. So I'd say that to employers. I'd also say do your research. This is an absolutely brilliant moment to do your own research, and in terms of how your staff are experiencing working from home. Get them to take pictures. There's tons on social media, people sharing pictures every single day, but get feedback and do research on what's challenging, what's been great, what's worked, and then make space to discuss that in a genuine, authentic sort of way, because there's great learning there for organisations.
Right. And then I don't know what you feel. Do you feel there's been a difference between the male and female experience of home working? I notice there's been comments in the media that it is different, particularly if there's children involved. But I don't know have you had any sense of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably too early to say from a research perspective, but I do know many scholars in my field in gender studies in organisational life and the workplace, absolutely are working on this right now. I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's a sense of it's particularly working parents, and it's particularly working mothers. And as you said, there's been plenty in the press that's come out that does suggest the experience of working at home and lockdown has impacted women more, that they have come off worse in this. I think there are plenty of examples of people who are dealing with the situation in an equal way, that they are sharing childcare. You know, that there might be a couple who are sharing childcare responsibilities and flexibly working. I know my husband and I, you know, we work in shifts. That's how it works. You know, I work in the morning, he works in the afternoon, and we swap over with childcare. So there's that. And I don't do any cooking. I would like to use this opportunity to thank my husband for doing all the cooking through this whole experience. But I think that there is a vast majority where, I mean, the statistics show that still the vast majority, sort of lion's share of domestic responsibility and childcare responsibility still does fall to women. And of course, you know, the vast majority of single parents are women. And so, you know, when you've got a childcare situation, as we've all, you know, seen in the press with schools shutting and that kind of thing, and the lack of other extended help, so not being able to access grandparents perhaps for childcare, and having a job, you know, there have been situations clearly where women have had to choose. So I think there will be plenty to say as we come out of this, that there will be some big discussion around the gender inequalities that this is sort of highlighted and have been experienced. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you, Harriet. That was really, really very interesting. I hope to see you very soon.
So do I. Yeah.
I
missed the Prosecco at the Gainsborough.
Yeah, I missed the Prosecco and the canapes. And, yeah, it will be so lovely when we're able to return. But I guess sort of distance of time makes it all the more worthwhile, and it will be very treasured when we do experience it again. So thank you very much. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, bye.